Sebastian pastors finish up their job, let's go ahead and stand as we continue in worship. sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we give you praise this morning, for you have overcome the grave. You have overcome sin. You have beat death, Lord. And we thank you that you have overcome. And so forever we will glorify your name. Forever we will praise your name. Forever we will give to you the glory that is due to you. Lord, we thank you. We thank you for a chance to have a relationship with you, that the creator of the universe would love us enough. Lord, we cannot give you praise enough. Lord, we love you. We thank you. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right. Good morning again. Last night we took the youth, about 13 of the youth, I think, and several of our adults went to help and transport and went out to Barn Fest. I hope that some of y'all went to Barn Fest. It was an awesome time of worship and evangelism. And over 200 people came forward during the invitation. Boy, that makes me happy. We are starting this new series, What Makes You Happy? And I guess I should have put a question mark at the end up there because in some ways this is a question that we need to answer. What makes us happy? But I could also have put a period up there because there are some things that I'm going to tell you, some facts that I'm going to give you about what makes you happy. And I guess it could be an exclamation mark up there because happiness does bring about that excitement and that energy. And this might be offensive to some of you that I'm sitting up here telling you that I'm going to tell you what makes you happy because you're like, I know what makes me happy. You ain't got to tell me what makes me happy. Well, for some of you that's true, but for some of you I would probably say that that's not true. And again, that's probably offensive. But there are some of you who haven't quite figured out yet what makes you happy. And I know that that's kind of strange for me to sit up here and tell you that I'm going to tell you what makes you happy, but think about everything else in your life. When you turn on the TV, there are people on TV that are going to tell you what will make you happy. This morning, the lady was telling me that Pio would make me happy. If I would buy Pio, I would lose weight and I would be happy. She told me that, I promise. You read magazines, and magazines tell you what will make you happy. You click on the internet, and the internet Car Gurus told me yesterday that a four-door F-150 four-wheel drive would make me happy. That's what they told me. But everybody is in the business of selling at least temporary happiness. Maybe you think you know the answer to the question, what makes you happy? But for most of us in here, I would say that the reason we need this series is that we may have forgotten what really makes us happy. Because even though the television can try to market and sell temporary happiness, there's nobody out there that's trying to sell actual happiness. So for the next few weeks, we're going to be answering this question and making this statement. What makes you happy? So we're going to jump on into this. And the first thing that you need to know about happiness is that happiness is more about who than what. Happiness is more about who than what. Think about that for just a minute. Go back to your earliest days before you ever started school, and you were in your fenced-in backyard. It didn't matter what you had if you didn't have a who, right? And if you had the right who's over in your backyard, it didn't matter what you had because you would be happy. And then you went to elementary school, and you found a group of who's. And as long as you were around that group of who's, it really didn't matter what you had to make you happy. Some of my favorite memories from kindergarten were in a cardboard cutout of a barn. Cardboard. It wasn't the cardboard. It was the who's inside the cardboard that made me happy. And then we go on to middle school and high school, and it doesn't matter what you have. It's all about having the right bunch of who's. It's all about belonging to a group of who's. Isn't that true? That it's way more about who than it is about what. So happiness is more about who than what. And to say it a different way, happiness is always associated with a who or two. Happiness is always associated with a who or two. Don't you think that's true? And that's the last time I'll attempt to sound like Dr. Seuss this morning. But think about it. If happiness was about a what? If happiness was more about a what, then what would happen to our happiness when our what broke? If happiness was about a what, then wouldn't we just all go out and get that what? And then whenever things went bad, we'd forget about that and go get our happy what? And our happy what would change everything for us? See, the thing is, it's not about a what. Happiness is about a who. Think about the last time you got a new phone. How happy you were momentarily, right? With your new phone. And then 3 months later, the Touch ID quit working. And then no longer are you happy anymore, right? Because that's not real happiness. But if happiness were about a what, then that phone would always make us happy. If an aging what deflates your happiness, then you weren't happy to begin with. If an aging what deflates your happiness, then you weren't happy to begin with. You get a new car and you think you're happy, but when it gets old, you ain't happy no more. You get a new job and you think you're happy, but then your relationships go south and you're no longer happy in your job, so you think to fix it you need a new job. And that may be true with a lot of things in our life. If we think we're getting our happiness from those whats, when those whats get old, our happiness will be deflated. Ultimately, our happiness is more about a who than a what. Let me give you some more evidence. How many of you have been overseas and you've seen places where people really have nothing at all? And yet, in those places where people really have nothing at all, they are still happy. How can that be? How can that mom, Tracy, how can that mom in that grass hut on top of that hill with nothing but about 5 little sticks and a little metal bowl to take care of her 5 kids and no door, how could she be happy if happiness was about a what? The answer is she couldn't have been happy. But she was, because happiness is not about a what, it is about a who. Some more evidence. Parents. Think about this for a minute. Parents are never any happier than their most unhappy child. Think about that for a minute. Parents have a very hard time being any happier than their most unhappy child. Why? Because your happiness is about your who's, not your what's. Or husbands. Husbands are never going to be any happier than their most unhappy wife. I mean, why is that? Why is that? Because happiness is about our who's, and when our who's are unhappy, That's right, happy wife, happy life. At the end of the day, your happiness is not tied to a what? It's tied to a who. One more piece of evidence and then we'll move on. I want you to understand that happiness is not about what, it's about whose. And here's how I know. We wouldn't want this to be true of anyone, but if somebody were to go in the hospital this week and find out that the end was very near, that their last breath on this earth was coming soon, right? Is there anybody that's going to turn and look at their husband and say, honey, I need you to go home, and I need you to get all my shoes out of the closet, and I need you to pack them up real neat and bring them up here because I got to spend a little more time with my shoes before it's over? Or would you turn to the nurse, men? Turn to the nurse and say, I need your help. You got to get me in a wheelchair and get me out to the parking lot. I need a little more time with my car before I go. Right? It's not going to happen. Because happiness is not about our what's. And at the end of our life, we're not going to be worried about reconciling with our what's. We're going to be worried about being reconciled with our who's. Because our happiness is not about our what's. It's about our who's. And at the end of our life, we're going to want to make peace with our who's, not our what's, because happiness is relational in nature. And I know that some of you guys out there, you're like, I don't need anybody. I don't need it. I've been accused of that by my wife many times. And that's not true. But I have been accused of that. But some of you guys, you might be like, I don't need anybody. Like, I'm fine on my own. I can do everything on my own. That's kind of like saying, I don't need food. You know who says I don't need food? Somebody who's never been without food, right? There's only two groups of people who say they don't need anybody. The first group of people are people who have always been surrounded by people who love and care for them. And they're just inundated with that naturally because of where God has placed them in life, in their family, and in their jobs, and in their schools. And so they can flippantly say, I don't need anybody, because they've never known what it's like to be without anybody. And the second group of people who would say, I don't need anybody, those are people who are trying to kid themselves. Those are people who understand what it means to be relationally isolated. They understand what it means to be alone, and they haven't figured out how to fix it yet. And because they haven't figured out how to fix it, they begin to say to themselves, I'm fine. I'm okay. I don't need anybody. That's dangerous. You know why it's dangerous? The same reason it would be dangerous to put jet fuel in your car out there. Because you were not designed to be relationally alone. And when you're relationally alone, you are a ticking time bomb. Eventually, you're going to go off. Because we were designed by God to be in relationship with other people, for other people, and for ourselves. We were designed for companionship and friendship and support. And when we're not doing that, we are not living up to our design. When we can't get what we want, we often will try to kid ourselves and tell ourselves we don't want it. It's just a defense mechanism. And in some cases, that defense mechanism really doesn't matter. Like I can tell myself I don't want a four-door F-150 four-wheel drive. I can tell myself that because really at the end of the day, that doesn't matter. But if I tell myself I don't want relationships with other people, that's dangerous. Because we were made for relationships. When it comes to relationships, it is unhealthy and ultimately deadly to think that we can get by without them. All right. Any questions? Let's make sure we're on the same page. The question is, what makes you happy? The answer is, nothing makes me happy. The question is, what makes me happy? The answer is, Nothing makes me happy, because at the end of the day, happiness is not about a what, it is about a who. Right? But there is something that all people who are happy tend to have in common. And that thing that's really not a thing is peace. All people who are happy have in common this concept inside of them of being at peace. It doesn't matter whether they're rich or poor. It doesn't matter whether they're an introvert or an extrovert. It doesn't matter whether they're single, married, or divorced. It doesn't matter whether they've had kids or haven't had kids. They have peace. They are comfortable in their own skin. And they're not worried about what you think about their situation, because they're at peace. Happy people are at peace. Happy people are at peace with themselves. There's not a war going on inside of themselves. They're not trying to pretend that there's something they're not. Happy people are at peace with themselves. They're okay. Happy people are also at peace with other people. They're not angry or bitter with anyone. They're at peace. And sometimes we hear someone's story, and someone tells us the story of what their ex-spouse did to them, or someone tells us the story about what their ex-boss did to them, or whoever. And we're like, how are you okay? Like, why aren't you in a mental hospital somewhere? And they say, well, you know what? I just forgave. And I moved on. They're not bitter. They've just forgiven. And they moved on. Happy people are at peace with themselves. They are at peace with others. And most of the time, they're at peace with God. Anything that would undermine your peace, any decision that you would make that would take away your peace, is a decision that you are making to take away your happiness. Think about it for a minute. Think about one of your last regrets. Think about one of your moments at work, or your times at home, or maybe even your weekends that you wish you hadn't have done. Think about it. When you make that decision that leads to regret and takes away your peace, you have also taken away your happiness. And when you do that, you are on the verge of taking away your happiness and removing your peace from yourself, from others, and even taking away your peace with God. As Christians, we understand that peace paves the way to happiness with ourselves and with other people. And the New Testament is full of teaching about maintaining peace with other people. Right? Think about it for just a minute. Of all of Jesus' teaching, how much of it is about relationships with the world around us? Relationships with other people? The answer is a tremendous lot is about those relationships. Right? So one day, Jesus was walking along, and this lawyer comes up to him. And this lawyer asked him a significant question. And I say significant question because so much of the time in the New Testament, when we see Jesus being asked a question, it's very trivial. It's a question that's trying to entrap Jesus, or to get Jesus to say something that would make him seem less than what he really was. But this question that this lawyer asked is a very profound question. And the question was this: what is the greatest or most important commandment? Because see, the Jews, this lawyer was a Jew and Jesus was a Jew, the Jews had over 600 laws that they tried to follow, that they tried to live out. And this lawyer comes up to Jesus and he says, which is the most important commandment? Now, this lawyer already has an answer in his mind. And so did every other Jew. That was kind of something that they thought about. Because, hey, if you're living life by checking off boxes, you got to know which boxes to check off first, right? Does that make sense? If you're living your life by obeying 600 things, you got to kind of prioritize. You with me? And so all Jews had kind of had the answer to this question of what would be the most important commandment. And I know what some of you are thinking, what does a commandment have to do with happiness? Because most of the time, when we think about commandments, we don't think about happiness. We think about the opposite of that. We think about, well, if I got to do this and I can't do that, then that's not happy, right? But here's the thing. When it comes to our relationship with God, right? There is something that is most important. And it's a commandment. And so Jesus answers that question in Matthew 22, 36 through 39. I'm skipping this question because I've already posed it. The question is this. Jesus replied, love. The lawyer's like, wait a minute. No, Jesus, I said which is the most important commandment. You know, like do not do this, do not do that. And Jesus said, I understand. Love. And the lawyer probably again is ready to interrupt. And Jesus goes on to say, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Now that doesn't sound like a command. Love. Like that sounds like relational stuff. Jesus? Yeah. It's relational. And it's the most important command. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. The most important commandment for you and I to have peace in our life is that we love God with all that we are. If you want to be happy, I'm going to say it again. If you want to be happy, love God. Now that's very simple, but that is hugely profound, right? Jesus said if you want to be happy, love God. But he doesn't stop there. Thank you. Listen to what he goes on to say. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. In other words, he says, look, the most important thing is love God, but it's equally important that you do this. What does it say? He says, and love your neighbor. That's others, right? Love others as yourself. That's you, right? Yourself. So Jesus says, if you want to have peace in this life, you need to love God. Because if you love God, you're going to have peace with God. And you need to love others, because if you love others, you're going to have peace with others. And then he says, if you're going to have peace in your life, you're going to have to love yourself to have peace with yourself. And it kind of sounds like, if you think about it, that Jesus wants us to be happy. It kind of sounds like that Jesus wants you and I to be happy by loving him, loving others, and loving ourselves. Guess what? Jesus wants you to be happy. Jesus wants you to be happy. And he wants you to know that your happiness is not about a what, it is about a who or to. Right? Jesus, I have taught this the other way in the past. I have said multiple times to groups of people, Jesus really doesn't care if you're happy. I was wrong. Jesus does want you to be happy. He just says there's only one way to be happy. And it's not about a what. It's about a who or two. At the core of who you and I are. And the reason I say at the core is because this is not a secondary thing. This is a primary thing. At the core of who you and I are, God wants you and I to be happy. And too often, when I was young, I thought just the opposite. Too often, I thought all those rules were about me not being happy. And some of you were like that too, because I know some of your stories, right? You thought that God was the cosmic killjoy. And He didn't want you to be happy. He just wanted you to do a bunch of do's and don'ts. But the truth is, our Heavenly Father, through Jesus, said that the most important thing to Him, the most important thing, is that you and I would have happiness when we are living at peace with Him, with others, and with ourselves. Here's the thing. If you and I resist God and what God wants in our lives, you and I are resisting happiness. If you and I reject God and what God wants in our life, you and I are rejecting happiness. Think one more time about the greatest regret of your life. Think about the greatest regret as you look back on your life. I would say that 99% of you, if you are in your right mind, would look back and the greatest regret in your life would not be about the car you should have bought or should have sold. It would not be about the TV that you spent too much for that never was what it was supposed to be. But the greatest regret in your life would be about the decision that you made that stole your peace from your relationship with God, others, or yourself, or maybe even all three, right? That's where your greatest regret would be. Because when you made that decision, you made the decision to abandon your peace with yourself, your peace with others, and your peace with God. When you are messing with your peace, you are making yourself unhappy. And Jesus invites you to make peace with God. He invites you to make peace with His Father. He invites you to make peace with one another. And He invites you to make peace with yourself. Because at the end of the day, your happiness is not about a what. It is about a who or two. Right? We're going to switch gears a little bit. Because this seems like it's coming out of left field, but you're going to have to hang on with me for a minute while I take a drink and switch gears. I have another idea for you. As we switch gears, it's going to take a minute. I'll come back around to it. But let's just throw that word up on the board. You ready? Say that word with me. 1, 2, 3, sin. Right? One more time. 1, 2, 3, sin. All right. So let's talk about sin for just a minute. How do you define sin? How do you describe sin? What is your definition of sin? Now, as Christ followers, as Christians, we know that our definition of sin comes from the New Testament, right? And maybe even some from the Old Testament if we're capable of wrapping our hands around all of that. But what exactly is sin? What does the New Testament, what does Jesus say that sin is? And at its broadest terms, sin is any time we break or we fall short of the standard that God has given us in the New Testament. Another way to think about it would be sin is any time we do something that we think that nobody else else should do. Right? That's a standard that we have. Nobody should do that. That's sin, right? Should people lie? No, of course not. Because that's sin. Should people cheat? Absolutely not, because that's sin. And it falls short of the standard that God has given us to live by in the New Testament. Now, here's what is true about all sin. Not just the big sins, but all sin. Sin separates. Sin separates. Think about your last conflict that you had in a relationship with anybody. Your last fight is what I'm saying. Think about the last time you were if you're married with your spouse, probably, right? Except for Mr. Randy, he never fights. He's perfect. But the rest of you husbands, right? Think about the last time you got in a fight with your wife. You wives, think about the last time you got in a fight with your husband. If you're not married, think about the last time you got in a fight at work. And I don't mean, hopefully, but although some of you, but anyway, think about the last time you got in an argument or a conflict or a disagreement with someone. Somebody sinned, right? Somebody fell short of God's standard in that conflict, right? Am I right? One more time, am I right? Yes, right? Somebody sinned. And when you left that argument, if it was at work or at school, you're like, I don't want to see them again. I'll turn my head when I walk down the hall. If they're in the break room, I'm not going in, because sin separates. If it was in your home, you're like, I'm going to another room. I'm getting in my car. I'm heading out for a little while, because sin separates, right? Sin separates relationships. And much of the time, it might be one person's fault, but much of the time it's both people's fault, right? But there is never a time when we get in that conflict and that argument where no one is at fault. It doesn't happen. There is sin when there is conflict, and sin separates. Think about your first marriage. Think about a boss that you had. Think about an employee that you had to work with. And you're like, I don't ever want to see them again. I had a boss like that. I had a preacher like that. That when I left, I was like, kicking the dust off my feet, and I'm like, I hope I never run into that guy again. Because sin separates. In relational conflict, somebody did something that you think that no one should do, right? And it separated the relationship. And when sin separates, it also erodes the peace that you and I are supposed to have with God, with others, and with ourselves. When sin creeps into any relationship, it begins to take away our happiness. Because sin, when it is eroding our relationship with others, when it is taking away our peace with ourselves, it is always robbing our peace with God. It is always separating us from God. When you sin against another person, you sin against God. Think about that for just a minute. You and I are God's children, right? He created us and He loved us to be His children. If you've got a neighbor next door and he beats up on your son, verbally or physically or anything else, and you go next door and he comes to the door and he says, I'm sorry about your son. He just was too bold. I had to put him in his place. But you and I are all right, aren't we? No. if you sinned against my son, you and I aren't all right. And at some point, you and I are going to have a conversation about it, right? It may be a week from now when I'm calm enough not to sin against you, right? But eventually, you and I are going to have a talk about it. Because sin separates. And when we have a conflict with someone else, it separates us from God. Why? Because God so loved the perfect people? No. God so loved the church people? No. We've been on this verse for 2 weeks. Because God so loved the world that he gave his one and only begotten Son. He loves these people that he has surrounded us with. And when we have conflict with them, we have conflict with God. Sin separates us from them, and sin separates us from God. And when we are separated from them and from God, we have lost our peace. Here's what we know. Everyone, anyone, can have a bad relationship with themselves. Now, some of you are like, I don't understand. Yeah, you do. When you get up in the morning and you go to look in the mirror, right? The first thing you notice is your hair. Well, maybe it's the second. Maybe your breath was first before you. Anyway, you noticed your breath and you took care of that. Then you looked in the mirror and you took care of your hair. But after you fixed your hair and you brushed your teeth, what do you see in the mirror? See, some days you see something that you don't want to see because you are not all right with yourself. And there's nobody in here who hasn't been in that position where you have been in a bad relationship with yourself. Because sin, in order to separate us and move us away from peace with ourselves, sin substitutes. Sin gets in the way of our relationship with ourselves, with God, and with others by substituting. Sin substitutes pleasure for fulfillment. Sin substitutes things for people. Sin substitutes images for intimacy. Sin substitutes experience for exclusivity. And oftentimes, sin substitutes the immediate for the ultimate. Sin is never your friend. And at the end of the day, sin undermines your happiness. It kills. Sin kills. It kills relationships. How do we know that? James, the half-brother of Jesus. Think about that for just a minute. There's a guy named James who wrote a book of the Bible. And he was the half-brother of Jesus, the little half-brother of Jesus. Now, a lot of you know what it's like to be the little brother, right? But imagine being the little brother of Jesus. Mary calls out, James, go get some water out of the well. Never mind, Jesus, go get some water out of the well. Don't get that one? Let's try this one. James, you don't have to cook dinner tonight like you were supposed to, because Jesus took care of dinner last night and there are plenty of leftovers. Y'all get that one? Fish, loaves, baskets? Never mind. Imagine being the little brother of Jesus, right? And James did not believe in his brother as the Messiah, as the Christ. In fact, history tells us that James did not turn to Christ until after he saw the resurrected Christ, because he had seen the Christ on the cross. He had seen his half-brother on the cross. Well, when he saw him out after the resurrection, then he believed. He was a little slow, but he fell in and he believed, right? And in James, he gives us this very important verse in James 1:15. And it starts out with the word then. Now, the reason it starts with the word then is because we're kind of picking up in the middle of a conversation But this verse will stand alone if you'll just trust me, okay? It's okay. We're not breaking too many exegesis rules right here, okay? So then, after desire. Now, y'all all know what desire is, right? Everybody with me? After desire has conceived. In other words, after desire has begun, has been initiated. That's what conception is, right? It is initiating life. So after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. Think about the imagery for just a minute. Got a little baby sin right here. My sweet little baby, right? He's so cute. He looks just like his mama, right? Does it sin? Never mind. Okay. You get the imagery of this baby sin? This little sin that's so sweet and innocent, it's not a big deal. You know, it's just not a real big deal. You've heard that before, right? About sin? That's really not a big deal. Because that's just a little thing. Guess what? It all starts as a little thing. After desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And what does sin do? Sin, when it is full grown, it gets ugly like me, right? Because it's full grown. When sin is full grown, it gives birth to death. Sin's no longer cute anymore, is it? Sin's no longer worth patting. And sin's no longer okay because sin always gives birth to death. What started as a cute little baby sin, when it becomes part of a relationship, it will ultimately bring death to the relationship. And you will not be at peace with others, you will not be at peace with God, and you will not be at peace with yourself, because sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Ultimately, happiness is tied to our who's, not our what's. All of our happiness is tied to a who or to. And sin separates. This series is so important to me. And it should be important to you. And I can tell you that it is important to Paul because he asked me to do it. This series is so important because ultimately, everybody who does what we do gets tired of watching people destroy their relationships and take away their peace from themselves, from God, and from others. It's heartbreaking. That's my fault. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. And this series is going to help us to refocus and help us to understand better what really makes us happy. I want to ask the band to come up for just a minute while I'm trying to wrap a bow around this because I'm running a little bit late. You ready? I'm gonna try and tie a knot on this thing. Since happy is about who, listen, come on, right here, 45 seconds. Since happy is about who and not what. Since happy is about people. And sin separates us from people, we cannot be happy if we haven't found the solution to the sin that is in our lives that is separating us from the peace that we are supposed to have with ourselves, with God, and with others. Jesus is the answer to the sin in your life that is separating you from your peace with yourself, peace with others, and peace with God. And I wasn't planning on having an invitation today. I told Johnny, just get up and play a song and we'll dismiss everybody. But this is the gospel. And if you are living without peace in your life, if you are living without happiness in your life, then I want to invite you to come down today. Maybe you need me or somebody else to talk to you about how a relationship with Jesus can be the answer to the greatest problem in your life. Or possibly, you just need to come down and pray. Because you have allowed sin to separate some of your relationships. And you've never made it right with God. And you've never reestablished peace with that other person. Jesus wants you to have freedom. When you have freedom from your sin, you can restore the peace in that relationship. And then you can be happy again. Let me pray for you. God, this message that on the surface just seemed about a cute rhyme from Dr. Seuss, that happiness is about a who or two. Lord, ultimately, we cannot have happiness unless we're in a right relationship with you. And the only way that can happen is through a relationship with your Son, Jesus Christ. And God, if there's somebody here today who's never heard that before, or just never made that commitment to your Son, Jesus, and restored their relationship with you, Lord, I pray that today would be the day of their salvation, that today they would come to you, confess their sin, repent from that sin, and ask you to be the Savior of their life. Lord, if there's somebody in here today that needs to make peace, maybe it's peace with a former employer, someone they used to call friend, or maybe the person they lie in the bed with at night. Lord, if they need strength for that, if they need counseling, whatever it is, I pray that you give them the courage to come forward and either talk to you or talk to someone else about their need for peace. In Jesus' name, amen.
Life Center, which is the building over with the green awning on it. Cost is $10. Need to be paid when you register. Deadline to register is August the 17th, which I believe is next Sunday, isn't it? Somewhere in that area? Next Friday, okay. So you have until this coming Friday to pay your $10. This is to cover cost of your supplies. HP now has an app where you can give and receive news about our activities and events. Keyword HPC Life app. If you want instructions on how to locate and install the app, you can pick up a sheet at the connection desk, which is right out there in the lobby. Sunday, August 26th, the youth group is going to Redneck Island and Cubic Beach Lake. Tell who enjoys that. They'll leave HP at 11:30, return at 7 p.m. Cost is $15, which does include your ticket and lunch. Baby dedication service Sunday, September the 2nd. Forms are available on the Next Level table. If you want to participate, Next Level is right where the lights are. We will also have a baptismal service on September 2nd, and I did get the baptistry fixed so it can perform its duties. Information about baptizing, who it is for, what to wear, etc., is available at the Next Level table also, and you can ask Phil or talk to Philip about the information. Operation Christmas Team is collecting items in the box in the lobby, and I want to say in the box in the lobby. August items are pencils, ballpoint pens, and coloring pencils, not crayons because they melt. That box is located right outside these doors and to your left. Life group leaders, if you would, please stop by the connection desk out there and pick up one of these so you can read them again to your class, okay? One added note says women's Bible study will be starting soon. Tammy Nicely, there she is, and Christy, there she is, will have 2 books in the back on Wednesday to let people choose which study to do. They'll take a vote on which book you'd like to be involved with. I guess it is not.
How many of you have tried to give through the app or have given through the app? Anybody yet? Okay, we might be the only ones then that are here. But if you give through the app, the cool thing about the app is that it is set up so that if you give the same tithe every 2 weeks or every month, you can set it up as a recurring gift so that it always comes out of your checking account on the 1st and the 15th or the 15th and the 30th. The other side of that is this: if you don't want it to take out that amount every 15th or every 30th, make sure you don't check the recurring gift box. Because if if you get paid a different amount each month or each week, however you're blessed by getting paid or whatever, and you don't want it to be a recurring gift, make sure you don't mark that because it'll automatically take it out the next month or the next 2 weeks, whatever it's toggled on. So just pay attention to that. But we have started giving through the app, and it's so easy. We don't have to remember our checks anymore. But I just want to encourage you to pay attention to those buttons as you're clicking through there.
God bless you all, and I guess we're dismissed.